Looking back on 2023, I think of some of my favorite games I played last year. It's wild to think that I, the classic Scaredy Cat, found that my top 3 video games of the previous year were this: 3. Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, 2. Alan Wake 2, and 1. Resident Evil 4 Remake. It's unbelievable that my top 2 games last year were horror games, which is very atypical for me. Even though it's atypical for me, audience received it well far and wide, with the awards season welcoming it with open arms, both being nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards. But there's a lot more below the beautiful graphics that I want to dig into. These two games and how they compare while also sharing a genre. Two sides of the same coin, you see. Slight spoilers for each of these games are going to be analyzed. Horror is an exciting and unique genre that is molded and experienced in various ways. From the running zombies in 28 Days Later, to the silent, methodical nature of Skinamarink, it seems like creatives are finding all sorts of ways to get a jump out of us. Alan Wake 2 and Resident Evil 4 Remake are perfect examples of how two horror games can approach horror differently yet deliver an equally satisfying experience. That difference is what I want to talk about. These two games demonstrate how the horror genre constantly changes and morphs, and how they break the rules. I'll be discussing the spaces we dwell in when we play and experience these games. I will also discuss the mantle of a hero, and how the hero archetype looks in different styles of horror media. For the convenience of time, I'm just going to be focusing on Alan himself and Leon Kennedy. So, with that much to discuss, I think we should get going. So let's start by breaking down horror as a genre. In Irene Chain's Playing Undead, we get this description and origin. Survival horror is a highly popular genre of video games that takes its cue from horror cinema, but modifies the experience, exploiting both fear and the urge to fight back. Alright, now let's put this framework on these two video games. Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest horror games of all time, and not only that, but one of the greatest games of all time. It falls under the survival horror subgenre of video games, which was made famous by the series initially, as the article explained. This game does plenty to disturb, frighten, and scare, with chainsaw doctors chasing you down when you get the last minute parry. Alan Wake is very disturbing in a different way. It's more of a psychological horror, where the greatest enemy is your own writing, a fresh and interesting concept. Not that the psychological horror is a new concept, it's just different through Alan Wake. These two games are incredibly unique in the way they fit in the horror genre framework. You realize how stark these differences are by considering the enemies that occupy these spaces. In the world that enemies in horror genre, specifically zombies, occupy, they have a strict set of rules emphasized by Bernard Perrin in his article Zombie Escape and Survival Plans, Mapping the Transmedial World of the Dead, where he writes, Night of the Living Dead established the rules or basics of the modern zombie. The dead now slowly, freely, and instinctively walk the earth with the purpose of eating and or infecting the living. They can only be killed by destroying the brain. RE4 follows these rules very closely. You gotta aim for the head. The headshot is always the most critical target for the enemy, and Leon's signature move is a roundhouse kick, which is often a kill shot and badass. While the zombies are more intelligent, they are wandering and moaning to themselves, but also a lethal threat. Let's see how this translates to a gaming experience like Alan Wake 2. The danger in Alan Wake 2 are creatures called the Taken. To break it down, they are regular humans consumed by an evil darkness that Alan must banish with his flashlight and then kill by shooting them. The difference between these ones and Resident Evil 4 is these enemies are more innovative, more aggressive, and way deadlier. So essentially they're still zombies, and while it isn't a traditional zombie game, the rules still apply to a game like Alan Wake 2. It however takes on an uncanny aspect, as described in Michael Fuchs in his article A Horror Story That Came True, Metalepsis and the Horrors of Ontological Uncertainty in Alan Wake. Transgression again takes an important role, since Sigmund Freud's starting point is the assumption that horror is evoked by the excessive stress that is laid on physical reality as opposed to material reality. Freud thus sees the collision or fusion of two worlds as one of the prime ways to elicit the uncanny. Nowhere in this idea is more apparent than in Freud's choice word, das Unheilig. After all, the term implies that the home, which is supposed to be a safe haven, known, protective, and comforting, has been invaded by an alien, strange, and unsettling presence, transforming the familiar into something partly unknown in the process. That's what makes Alan Wake so special. It respects the source material but breaks the rules established by a typical survival horror and zombie flick structure by making the threats much more intimate. From the beginning, nowhere is really safe. Our safe spaces that we typically find ourselves solace in are infiltrated, and that's where it differs from Resident Evil 4. It has highs and lows, and you know when you're safe, but in Alan Wake 2, you can't be sure what's behind the next tree. These safe spaces are important when it comes to experiencing video games. It's super simple, but not often analyzed in this way. The spaces of the worlds that we dwell in while playing a video game are a vital piece in the puzzle that makes a video game feel more immersive and full. When the world isn't there, there is literally no ground for the character to develop. This is a perfect segue into the next section. When we start Resident Evil 4, our first encounter with the undead-controlled Spanish villagers is in a traditional setting. The back room of a house on the outskirts of the village was very traditional, and scary enough to give me a jump the first time I saw him creep into the basement after I killed him once. Scary stuff, but ultimately effective. But it's what happens next that they break the rules in a very atypical way for what people would consider traditional survival horror and zombie horror in a way. They make the next major encounter the village, a completely open space where you have to fend off villagers for the next few minutes before they're called away. It's intense, and you must play it to experience the truly special encounter. It breaks so many rules that the genre and style usually try to respect, but it doesn't so well that you just have to let them take it and run with it. Placing the player in a completely open space is bold, and somehow makes you feel even more vulnerable, attacking you with swarms rather than singular threats. Now, let's see how the first encounter in Alan Wake 2 plays out and how it sticks and differs from those traditional rules. First off, you don't even play as Alan Wake himself from the beginning of the game. Instead, you play as Detective Saga Anderson, who is investigating a cultist killing. As you explore the game's mind place, you will eventually unravel the clues and figure out what happened to Detective Nightingale by the lake. Suddenly, Nightingale comes back to life and goes on a rampage. Using your flashlight, you ultimately defeat him by dispelling the darkness that had taken control of Nightingale through a showdown that takes place across a basement morgue, a different kind of enclosed space. The point is that Alan Wake 2 introduces a unique space to showcase evil, which is different from Resident Evil 4 and its more traditional approach. However, it also demonstrates how horror can evolve and be reinvented, subverting expectations and reminding us of how terrifying it was to be a subject of horror in the past. Gone are the days of the single-room showdown, and time to welcome in open-area combat with pinpoint precision dodges. We can see in both games, one has an older structure with a new set of paint, and one entirely new structure, not even mimicking the previous game. It's almost like the spaces we dwell in become obsolete. In fact, in Alan Wake 2, when we finally get to play as Alan, you are met with one of the most fear-inducing spaces I've played in a video game yet. You wake up in a TV studio only to exit the doors and be met with one of the most fleshed out spaces, New York City, filled with enemies around every corner and secrets galore. Now you don't have to search every single space to progress. In fact, you can just walk straight to the next section. But it's the freedom that sets Alan Wake 2 apart from the other game, while somehow still keeping it linear, which can almost be a downside because you want to be able to explore all of New York. Alas, this is not the case, and we must revisit it some other time. This is a perfect time to segue into my next topic of conversation, hero archetypes and what it means to be a hero. When you think of a hero, someone like Leon Kennedy comes to mind. Handsome, noble, brave, and loyal. It's not that Alan isn't a noble or brave person. He is, just in a different way. Bergstrand and Jasper write, sources of hero strength can include personal physical power, intelligence, various technical skills such as firing a gun, virility, creativity, bravery, aristocratic birth, supernatural favor or lineage, wealth, even moral purity. Leon's strength comes from physical power, technical and tactical skills, alongside with his bravery, virility, sarcasm, funnily enough, and Alan would seem at first to get his power from moral purity, bravery, and creativity, but ultimately it turns against him, along with some technical skill. They are both heroes of their own story, but not exactly as they seem on the surface. I did some digging and found that they represent two very different types of heroes. Leon is a classical hero, described as brave, strong, and selfless. Classical heroes are willing to put their own lives on the line to protect others and fight for justice. They are characters who have abilities, skills, or powers that set them apart from their peers and contemporaries. Alan would fall under the tragic hero mantle, described as usually noble and have a tragic flaw that ultimately leads to their downfall. This couldn't be truer for Alan Wake. His ultimate flaw is his creativity, which he uses to write himself into the dark place where he traps himself with his own manuscript pages. This reminds me of a classic mythological tragic hero doomed by his own creativity, which takes me to my next point. I would like to compare in the framing of two mythological hero stories, Perseus and Orpheus, Perseus being Leon and Orpheus being Alan. So let's cross-examine these stories with each other and see how they compare and contrast. Let's start with Leon. Leon is on a mission after successfully dealing with Raccoon City, and he must go and rescue the president's daughter, Ashley, who's been taken by a strange cult in the mountains of Spain. Just like how Perseus, just coming back from dealing with Medusa, Raccoon City, goes to rescue and save Andromeda, Ashley, chained to the rock on the beach, captured by cultists. It's kind of a stretch, but stay with me. I still really think that this type of mythology, especially with something like Alan Wake 2, which is dripping with Norse mythology, but in this case Greek mythology, fits the bill really well. Through the lens of Orpheus, Alan Wake becomes an extremely interesting character in the game. So to compare, after Orpheus loses his love, Eurydice, he searches through Hades to find her. That's a very simple way of telling the story, and not even half of it. But it fits with the basic story of the original Alan Wake. Alan searches Cauldron Lake and the Dark Place in his own personal catabasis to find Alice after she goes missing. However, the character of Orpheus and Perseus compared to Leon and Alan are even closer than the stories are. Quote, Orpheus, we know him as a poet, a musician, and a myth. While not a musician or a poet, Alan is a writer and a creative mind, like Orpheus, who ultimately damns his wife into Hell/Hades just by writing. Redditor PK Thunda pointed out these similarities in a post. For starters, both Alan and Orpheus journeyed into a version of an underworld to retrieve their lost love, Alan for Alice and Orpheus for Eurydice. Minor but interesting points nonetheless. Orpheus is a bard, musician, and poet, a writer in some way. Even more minor and even more interesting, Orpheus was said to be an augur and a seer, prophetic. Alan's para-utilitarian ability is that of prophecy, which is only amplified by his use of the typewriter and the dark place. Orpheus's music was said to be able to charm and influence everything, could charm the birds, fish, and wild beasts, coax the trees and rocks into dance, and divert the course of rivers, both living and inanimate, which can also be said of Alan's manuscript pages. His tragic flaw is his creative abilities, and in turn, the layers upon layers of complicated manuscript pages and stories that he's made to keep Scratch at bay. I could get into Scratch right now, but that's another 10 minutes I don't have. Perseus has been described as brave, cunning, attractive, and charismatic. That sounds like someone we might know. Mr. Kennedy, you're needed on set, please. Leon personifies all of these qualities best. Some even call him the perfect hero. Just like Perseus, he never fails to rise to the challenge of taking on a monumental task. Whether it's an enemy or a tricky situation, Leon will see someone turn into a literal demon just to have a quick quip and get right to kicking their ass. He's almost too perfect. With his boyish looks, he can shine through all the trying times, saving Princess Andromeda, Ashley, and escaping without a bother. All that while Alan is trying to fight for his life, typing out manuscript pages and fighting shadow demons. To end, the similarities between the two games make us realize that a piece of horror media can be diverse in many ways through compelling storytelling and intense gameplay. As we journey through the eerie landscapes of Cauldron Lake and the treacherous villages of rural Spain, we confront not just the monsters lurking in the shadows, but also the complexities of human nature and the internal struggle between light and darkness. Though distinct in their execution, these two games ultimately share a common thread, a testament to the evolving landscape of horror in video games and its ability to captivate audiences across different tastes and preferences. Whether we find ourselves immersed in the heart-pounding action of Resident Evil 4, or unraveling the mysteries of Alan Wake 2, we are reminded of the power of storytelling to evoke fear, curiosity, and on top of all that, a sense of catharsis. As we go on, we remember all of the awesome times we had suplexing old Spanish men into the ground and all of the cultists we put a cap in. So let's raise our flashlights high and embark on our next adventure, for in the darkness there lies both terror and triumph waiting to be discovered.